You hear it a lot these days, right? That the state is making a comeback. But this explainer isn't really about answering why that's happening. Instead, it's about offering a structural reframing, a totally different way to process this huge global shift we're all witnessing.
So let's start by questioning that very premise. The central idea here is that the state isn't returning because of some new ideology. No, what's really happening is a much more fundamental, much more structural change under the surface.
And here it is, the fundamental shift. The core thesis is that reality itself, the physical, geopolitical world, has evolved. It's reached a point where markets just aren't the universal tool for allocation anymore. In many critical areas, the problems we're facing have simply outgrown the solution that markets can offer.
Okay, so to really unpack this, we're going to walk through 5 distinct parts. First, we'll look at the shifts in policy that you can actually see. Second, we'll break down the 2 core logics for how resources get allocated. Third, we'll talk about the return of real-world constraints. Fourth, what that means for a world that now runs on priorities. And finally, we'll land on the big structural question that this new framework leaves us with.
So let's start by grounding this idea in things we can actually observe. What does this shifting reality look like in practice?
Well, the evidence is pretty much everywhere you look. We're seeing a sharp increase in state-level interventions, governments stepping into the flow of capital and goods. Think about the increasing export controls on critical tech like semiconductors and AI, or the rise in industrial subsidies to bring production back home. We're also seeing widespread financial and tech sanctions used as policy tools, and whole new security frameworks for supply chains. These aren't just isolated incidents. If you step back, you can see they form a very clear pattern.
To make sense of this pattern, we really need a different framework, one that goes beyond the old, simple binary of state versus market. And that means we need to understand 2 very distinct logics for how resources get allocated.
First up is market logic. The best way to think of the market is as an optimization device. Its main job is to allocate resources with maximum efficiency, and it does this using one core signal, price.
And the second is state logic. Now, it's really important not to see this as the market's opposite, it's just a different system altogether. The state acts more like a constraint processing device. Its goal isn't really optimization, it's about managing hard limits and bottlenecks. And so it allocates resources based on a hierarchy of priorities.
So when you put these 2 logics side by side, their differences become really clear. The market's mechanism is price. The state's mechanism is priority. The market works on a key assumption, that resources have high mobility, that they can move around easily. The state, on the other hand, operates when that mobility is low or blocked. So their goals are just fundamentally different. For the market, it's optimization. For the state, it's allocation.
So, if market logic really thrives in a world with high mobility and very few constraints, that brings up a critical question, right? What happens when those conditions change? And this leads us to the core catalyst for the whole shift we're seeing today, the return of hard constraints.
And these constraints aren't abstract. We're talking about tangible, real-world bottlenecks in the global system. Things like the energy transition creating new scarcities, physical infrastructure hitting its capacity limits, the return of intense geopolitical rivalry redefining trade, fierce technology competition creating new barriers, and of course, supply chain security becoming a central concern for everyone.
And here's the crucial point. As all of these constraints pile up, that foundational assumption of market logic, that resources can move around freely, it just starts to erode. Capital, goods, and technology simply can no longer move with the same freedom they once did.
This really gets to the heart of the reframing. The shift we're observing isn't primarily ideological. It is a pragmatic, structural response to a new reality of resurgent physical and political barriers. You could say it's a return of physics, not ideology.
So let's move on to our 4th section and look at the consequences. What does a world that's increasingly governed by constraint and priority actually look like?
The contrast between eras is becoming really stark. The period we just left was characterized by price-based adjustments within a market-led system of free exchange. But the era we're entering is more and more defined by allocation under constraint, a system where priorities, not just price, determine how resources are distributed. And that, by definition, is a state-led logic.
You can even visualize these shifts as gradients. The momentum towards frictionless markets and globalization is clearly trending down. At the same time, the momentum towards strategic allocation and resource nationalism is trending up. The overall direction of change is clear.
This new reality creates a kind of logical cascade.
For decades, the default mode was optimization. But as soon as constraints appear, the primary objective shifts to securing those resources. And once you've secured a limited resource, what's the necessary next step? It's allocation, the act of deciding how it gets distributed based on priorities.
And all of this brings us to our final section. Now that we have this framework, the goal isn't to give you a definitive conclusion, it's to help us formulate a more precise, a more structural question.
The conventional way to ask the question is this: are markets retreating?
But this framework lets us ask a more structural question. What if it's not that markets are retreating, but that the underlying conditions that sustain market logic are beginning to disappear?
And this reframing offers one last, important clarification. The issue might not be that the state is getting stronger. It might be that the nature of our global challenges, things like energy security or supply chain resilience, is shifting into domains that require the state's logic of priority-based allocation to be solved.
So the key takeaway here is to try and see the state and the market not as ideological opposites, but simply as different allocation logics. They are two distinct systems for organizing reality. And if that's the case, the critical question isn't which logic is superior, but which logic is being demanded by the constraints of our current reality.